Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are very happy to host you here for this symposium on the promise of gene therapies, realizing the promise of gene therapies, exploring health system challenges. This symposium has been organized together by Pfizer and ARM, the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, and is the ending process after 2 years of roundtables that we had last year and the year before here at the World Health Summit, discussions with a large number of stakeholders, about 40, 50 different stakeholders from different stakeholders groups, and we had great discussions, and we want today with some of the representatives of these discussions and these roundtables to share the output together. Here, very high-level description of the agenda. We'll go through the next 1 hour and a half, discussing, first of all, introducing a bit the gene therapies and what is their impact and what is their promise, and then going more in depth with 2 sessions. One looking at healthcare delivery, so changes that are needed in terms of healthcare delivery in healthcare systems, and the second part more on access and what is needed from an access perspective. And then we'll be closing. Let me first introduce ARM. So as I said, Pfizer and ARM have been organizing this session. I'd like to thank Jennifer and the Pfizer team for organizing and hosting with us this symposium. ARM is the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, is a membership association, brings together more than 400 organizations in the cell and gene therapy space, and we are a global multi-stakeholder organizations with a large number of therapeutic developers, but also other industry players and patient organizations, academic centers, and also investors, for example. So it's a very broad group of stakeholders, and our objective is really to advance the sector. We say patients are our North Star. We are driven by trying to find ways through healthcare systems for patients to get access to cell and gene therapies. And later on, I'm going to go into more detail, why we're doing this, what is the promise, and what is the impact, or can be the impact on patients. But first of all, I would like to have all the panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves. I'll start with myself. My name is Paolo Morgese. I'm Vice President, Public Affairs Europe at ARM, and I lead ARM's European activities. Maybe we want to start for the next one. Professor Mare, you want to go first?
I'm a full professor of public economics, not finance, public economics at Lewis University in Rome, and I've been an economic advisor for many years at the Treasury Department on the issues of budget and the European accounting rule and the health sector, of course.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Jennifer Young. I lead global business policy and public affairs at Pfizer. It's a pleasure to be partnering with all of my colleagues here today, and certainly with ARM, building on the work we've carried forward over the past couple of years. And my team is focused on helping to deliver breakthroughs that change patients' lives across all of our therapeutic areas at Pfizer, including rare disease.
Mm-hmm. Good morning. My name is Durham Wong-Rieger, and I am really delighted to be here, part of the roundtables for the last couple of years that Paulo mentioned, and I'm really happy that we're having the opportunity to present some of what we've been discussing. I am President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, also the immediate past chair of Rare Diseases International, and also the president of the Asia Pacific Alliance of Rare Disease Organizations. So working across 3 levels, from national to regional to the global level, and really looking forward to this discussion.
Good morning. My name is Sung-Hee Cho, and I am with the Milken Institute. We're a think tank organization based in the U.S., and I help oversee the work that we do in biomedical innovation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good morning. I'm Paul Fennessy. I'm from Melbourne, Australia. For most of the last 20 years, I was the health technology person in the State Department of Health, providing advice on what health technologies should or shouldn't be introduced into our public hospital system. I've recently left there, but my last role there, I was responsible for overseeing the introduction of new and emerging the advanced therapies into our public hospital system. And it's a joy to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. So let's start quickly because we are a bit behind schedule, so I'll go a bit quickly through my presentation. This introduction, really the idea is really to give you an overall view of the sector and gene therapies. And let's start with a video that tells us much about what we are here for.
Hi, I'm Amanda Cook. I have 2 children with SMA, one Jackson, one Weston. Jackson was originally diagnosed with SMA in 2017 at 5 months old. We stayed in the hospital until the new year, and in February he passed away due to no treatment to SMA at that time. Four years later, Weston comes along, and little did I know at the time he was going to be SMA type 1 as well. I knew that he was going to have SMA. It was just an initial gut feeling, mom instinct, I guess, and later confirmed with amnio, and then of course later confirmed with newborn screening, thankfully. That proceeded to me jumping the gun and going ahead and getting the ball rolling with gene therapy and getting all that going. When Weston received the treatment, like I said, it was a weight lifted off my shoulders as soon as that button started. A healthy 11-day-old baby getting this awesome treatment and just waiting for the outcome of what would happen. With Weston, the way he is reaching all of his milestones is absolutely amazing. He's walking, talking, eating, running, playing baseball. So he's doing phenomenal, and those things are absolutely a miracle. It's unreal to see an SMA child running, walking, talking, doing normal kid activities, and it's also heartbreaking just because of the last experience. I'm just happy to see him being able to thrive like a normal 2-year-old, be able to play with his friends at daycare or his cousins, and he shouldn't be. Potentially, medically, he should not even be here just because of a diagnosis. Knowing how new gene therapy is, and it's a once-in-a-lifetime treatment, it's absolutely amazing. We're so thankful that we were able to receive it. Okay, blow him a kiss. Tell him bye.
So, I think it's a very inspiring video, and it's a testimony of many other successful treatments that happen and are going to happen thanks to gene therapy. And in some way, it's tell us much about how the world can change or will change if we manage to let's say, adapt our healthcare systems to gene therapies. And that's really the challenge we have ahead of us. And this is what we're really going to discuss with the panelists today. What is gene therapy? So gene therapy is therapeutic procedure. It's a pharmaceutical, of course, that transfers a gene or new gene into the human body, human cells. So that can be either in vivo, so done directly into our human body, or ex vivo, taking a cell out, translating and transferring the DNA, and then re-injecting in the body. There are different ways of doing gene therapies and different technology platforms. And here there are some examples in these slides, like RNA interference, gene therapy as such, and gene editing. There are many more, or mixes of those that are developing. And it's a sector that's really advancing very fast, and definitely is the future of medicine. Gene therapy represents the third wave of medicine in terms of developments, innovations we had. So we started many years ago, let's say in the 19th century probably, with small molecules, and then that in some way targets symptomatic, have a symptomatic effect on symptoms of diseases. Then moved to biologics in the 80s, and that have more disease-modifying effect. And then we're moving to gene therapies, really transformative. In some cases, we expect to be able to cure. This is really high level, but I would say our health system is systems are very much adapted to the first two waves, and mainly, to small molecules in some way, the way evidence is developed, in the way evidence is assessed, in the way healthcare is provided, especially in outpatient setting. Gene therapies mainly target genetic diseases. So we have around 7,000 diseases. Most of them don't have a treatment. In theory, the potential is huge because gene therapies can address probably a large majority of these genetic diseases. And most of them are also rare diseases. So really, let's say the potential to address unmet needs out there is huge. In terms of data, this is our data that are published by ARM, and this is the last quarter that has been published in our sector data reports. So quarter 2, 2024. As you can see, in terms of numbers, the sector is doing very well, with a large number of clinical trials that are ongoing. I'll go a bit more in detail on this in a minute. Around 2,000 clinical trials, around 3,000 developers spread across the globe. An investment that is, we had in the last couple of years a bit of challenges in terms of investment due to the financial crisis, but things are getting better this year. This slide shows clinical trials by prevalence across a global level. And the last columns, let's say on the right side, show exactly the numbers, the total numbers for phase 2, 3, and phase 3 trials. And these are programs that basically are close to to get to patients. So we're around 100 and something clinical trials that in very short time frame, let's say the last 2 to 5 years, will potentially get to patients. And the success rate for these clinical trials is very high. So we know that, let's say, there is a very large pipeline with a large number of these medicines that are getting to patients. And here more closely to what's happening this year. As you can see, we have already 6 new cell and gene therapies that have been approved, 8 pending, and some that are in the pipeline for next year. But basically, overall, 14 expected for this year across US and Europe. And now we are moving to the discussion. And as I said before, we're going to cover into 2 distinct panels. And the first one is more going to cover healthcare delivery, so how healthcare system and healthcare delivery are going or need to change and to be adapted to cell and gene therapies. And the second one more on access. So, and this is the panel. And this, in orange, you see the areas, let's say, that are more concerned and related to healthcare delivery. And you can see them. I'm not going to list in detail, but from diagnosis to treatment to follow up, there are complexities that need to be addressed by healthcare systems and healthcare centers. One aspect that, for example, is very typical of cell and gene therapy, given the complexity of treatment, that you need very specialized centers that are called hubs, that basically serve with technology and skills, from healthcare providers, a broader area with a set of treating, smaller treating centers. So with that, I'll move quickly into the first presentation. Paul, you want to come here, or you want me?
Thank you, Paolo, and good morning again, everyone. So the next couple of slides are going to be presenting the experience in Australia over the last couple of years regarding the delivery of gene therapies. I'll be walking through some of the challenges that our health system has faced and our clinicians face, but also some of the structure, and some of these are quite structural as well. And I'll be ending the short presentation with potential ways forward to ensure that the health system can be prepared for the tsunami of gene therapies that are coming down the pipeline. So you may well be aware that Australia is a federation. We have a federal government and we have 6 states and 2 territories. And the federal government essentially makes the big policy decisions and then expects the states to implement those policy decisions. In addition, the federal government runs and funds our universal pharmaceutical system, whereby people can access very cheap pharmaceuticals to be used in the community. But it's our public hospital systems, run by our state and territory governments, that fund and run the public hospital systems. So all of a sudden we're seeing that the decisions in Australia to fund or to reimburse gene therapies are made by the federal government up here, but the responsibility for jointly funding and delivering the gene therapies is being made by our state and territory hospitals. But often they're not talking to each other. And COVID has really made an impact in ensuring that there is an ongoing communication. And this is really borne out by the case study. And thanks, Paolo, for that short presentation around that example around SMA. In Australia, I said that the federal government makes decisions at the high level, and our federal government has determined that there are 3 funding mechanisms for gene therapies in Australia, which doesn't make it easy for the clinicians, for the hospitals, for industry to determine which is the appropriate pathway to go down. But with Zolgensma to treat SMA, the decision was made that this will be funded through our universal pharmaceutical system. So the federal government went through its usual health technology assessment process, made a decision to fund the technology, and then announced that technology, that gene therapy was available. The problem was that these children would be treated in our public hospital systems. So our state health departments, our public hospitals, weren't aware of the decisions that had been made. And this came to light 2 weeks after reimbursement was approved, whereby our Children's Hospital in Melbourne rang me and said, Paul, we have an eligible child who should receive Zolgensma, but the financial delegation means that our Chief Executive Officer in the hospital couldn't place an order for the treatment. So again, our hospital system wasn't prepared to even initiate the procurement process to get a $2.5 million product into the hospital. So that meant that the board had to be, the hospital board needed to come together and make that decision, which slowed down access. In addition, the pharmacy, the pharmacists who were going to be responsible for the procurement and for the preparation and disposal of the gene therapy didn't know what was coming down the pipeline, so they weren't prepared. They had no GMO compliant hoods or infrastructure, so they had to ask the on-site Medical Research Institute to vacate one of their compliant hoods, so that shut down medical research for the day while they prepared the gene therapy. And that was fine at the time for one therapy. But given that there is this tsunami of gene therapies coming through, there is a lot of anxiety around how are our hospitals going to be ordering and procuring these therapies? How are they going to be paying for them? Because these are going to be presenting a significant cash flow issue for our public hospitals. And do we have the sufficient infrastructure to ensure that we can treat patients with these gene therapies as more are approved down the line? So there are these procurement, cash flow, reimbursement issues, but also because COVID came through and disrupted the normal communication mechanisms, we weren't able to share this information with hospitals and our health departments across the country. So what we were seeing was that there was nationally inconsistent care being provided to patients for advanced therapies, including gene therapies, and that didn't bode well for the children who required those therapies. So this lack of communication by the policymakers who were overseeing the implementation really affected the access to treatment for many patients. So this slide summarises those issues. There really was a lack of national protocol and processes and coordination between the policy and reimbursement decision makers, between the federal government and the state governments who were responsible for delivery of gene therapies. There's no clear funding pathway for gene therapies. There are 3 funding pathways, and it's unclear how gene therapies go down which particular pathway. There are these cash flow issues, these procurement issues. There are structural issues in hospitals around having the necessary infrastructure for handling, preparing and disposing of GMO products. And along with the nationally consistent care delivery, it meant that no hospital system was able to plan for what was coming down the pipeline. And there are cases where that has impacted patient care. So what we've tried to do is to seek forgiveness rather than ask permission for our masters. So what we were able to do without asking formal approval, because we were still recovering from COVID, was in the absence of any of these interjurisdictional governance mechanisms whereby the state and territory and federal government departments could talk to each other, we did so informally. We created a regular, informal, virtual meeting pathway. We would have Teams meetings every couple of weeks where we would share experiences around what worked, what didn't work in our respective states and territories around procurement, around preparation, around infrastructure. And that allowed us to come together and agree on that the thing that we needed to do was to push for the development of a national framework that addressed the health technology assessment, the funding and the implementation aspects that were being observed at the state and hospitals and the health departments. So essentially all of the states and territories ganged up on the federal government and said, hey, there's an issue here. You are making these broader decisions. but there's no mechanism, there's no policy, there's no process, there's no protocol around how we need to ensure that the care that's delivered in our hospitals for gene therapies is nationally agreed, nationally consistent, safe, and ensures the best outcomes for patients. So the government's agreed that what we needed was a national policy, and the front cover of that policy is on the screen now, the framework for the assessment, funding and implementation of high-cost, highly specialised therapies and services. So this document is high level. It describes these issues at a high level, and currently an implementation plan is currently being developed with detail around who should do what, where and when in Australia. It needs to better engage with consumer groups, with patient groups, with industry. It doesn't do as much of that as it should at the moment, but there's recognition that that engagement with all stakeholders is important to ensure that everyone's on the table and knows what's going on. One thing that has fallen out of this document is that our Hospital Pharmacists Society in Australia has recognised that they can't wait, and because the only training they get around gene therapies is from the pharma companies, which is fine with the few gene therapies available at the moment. But with the tsunami of therapies coming through, our pharmacists recognise that, again, they need a nationally consistent policy, a national policy to ensure consistency and safety for the preparation and disposal of these gene therapies over time. So our hospital pharmacists are using this to leverage the introduction of new training programs and engagement strategies with pharma and with other hospitals around Australia to learn more about what needs to be done in terms of health sector preparedness, because they know that with what's coming down the pipeline, the patients can't wait. So I think I'll just leave it there, and that's the Australian experience over the last couple of years. Thank you.
Hello, I'm pleased to be here to talk about some of the issues around care delivery as well as access as it relates to gene therapy. I think too often when we think about care delivery and access, the conversation often focuses on the regulatory approval process and the barriers to that, as well as to the reimbursement mechanisms. And those two aspects are foundational, essential, and that's absolutely the right place to focus. But I would also argue, and from our experience, what we have seen is that focusing on those two elements alone will not ensure that patients who need these types of treatments will actually access them. And that is because there are significant infrastructural, logistical, educational needs in support of gene therapy, and it is only by solving that in a more holistic manner that we can ensure that access and these types of therapies are ultimately delivered. When we think about the sickle cell gene therapies that were approved in the US at the end of 2023, I think it's important to know that, yes, these therapies are groundbreaking, but also to know that these therapies also take 1 year out of a patient's life. They also require, as part of the FDA requirements, 15 years of follow-up after treatment. Another thing to know is that part of the treatment process requires high-dose chemotherapy in order to prepare the cells for the modified stem cells. And so what is the side effect of chemotherapy? Infertility. And so you can think about the implications of this therapy on family, on work. You know, these are the kind of the questions that patients and caregivers have to think about when confronted with a choice of a gene therapy. So it is not a matter of just regulatory approval. It is not a matter of just reimbursement. There are so many of these different questions that come up as well. And so it is with these types of questions in mind that the Milken Institute embarked on some work with patient advocacy organizations, health systems, as well as other stakeholders within the health ecosystem to start to articulate what some of these questions are that a patient may ask or that a caregiver may ask when confronted with the choice of a gene therapy. And that led us to create this patient and treatment journey map that you can see. It's a very little box over there on the left, and it's accessible on our website for those who'd like to have a closer look. But what I will just highlight is that we tried to organize the patient journey into 4 stages: the pre-diagnosis stage, the diagnosis stage, the treatment stage, and the follow-up stage. And what we sought to do is think about what are the questions at each stage of the patient journey that may come up within a patient and provider discussion, within family discussions, and what are the barriers to addressing those questions. And our thinking is that by talking about what these questions are, and by also thinking about what are the barriers to those, that one, we can help facilitate patient and provider dialogue, but also provide a framework to the ecosystem, many of which are developing tools and resources that are designed to support patients. Help them think about what are the questions beyond perhaps the obvious around the financial that need to be addressed through the tools and resources that are available. And so just a kind of I just want to highlight a couple of things that we had identified. I mean, I think on the pre-diagnosis side, certainly what kind of doctor to see is a very, very big question, and having access to the right specialist once you identify who that doctor would be. And the diagnosis, is there a treatment? What are the treatment options? As well as, are there clinical trials, right, with more advanced therapeutic options, and how do I learn more about them, which is quite challenging for many patients. Then there are the treatment. You know, a question that often doesn't get asked, especially in the context of gene therapy, but for a lot of other therapies, what if it doesn't work? And in the context of gene therapy, there are a lot of implications if a therapy doesn't work. And so maybe we'll get into that a little bit more, but that is something where educational resources really have to focus on addressing. And then the follow-up, I mentioned at the top, 15 years of follow-up for patients. Now, what does that look like in my life? How often do I need to engage over these 15 years? How is it even going to work if I had to go travel to a center that is not near my home in order to get this therapy? And so these are kinds of all of the types of questions. Again, you know, we raise these questions and we raise the barriers in order to help, again, facilitate the dialogue, and then also provide a resource to all of you as you're thinking about care delivery and access and the types of supports that patients need. Thank you.
Standing behind the podium doesn't work because then I can't see the slides. But as long as you can see me, I think we're okay. So thank you very much. Really, really delighted to be here and to really provide some, I think, context around the patient perspective. So I'm just going to give you a number of stories and kind of take you through to picking up on, I think, both the themes that you know, Paul and Sunhee said, but also kind of putting it into, as I say, some realistic context. So this is, and I think this picks up on some of the issues around infrastructure. Two twins born in Canada. They were misdiagnosed from the very beginning. So by the time they were actually diagnosed with SMA, they were almost a year old. They actually didn't get access to treatment, then for probably another 6 months, their tests were lost in the hospital. They didn't get to the right specialist. They lived in a somewhat rural community. So traveling, I think as people talked about, was also a challenge for them. So by the time they actually got into the point where they could, in fact, the parents, being immigrant parents, actually worked very hard to identify what the options were, identified the fact that they really wanted to get gene therapy for their children, started the process for it. By the time they began to actually get seriously with a clinician who was able to pick them up, they were over the age of 2. And at that time, gene therapy for SMA was only available for children under the age of 2. This was, I think, partly in terms of how the labeling was actually done. So they had not gotten into newborn screening at that time because we didn't have it yet. As we say, with all the misdiagnosis and the lack of access, by the time they were actually able then to apply to a clinician, they were almost 3 years old. We finally had a clinical trial that was going to be opened up for 3-year-olds. And the clinician says, I've got room for 1 child. So I can do 1 of them. I can't do both of them. I only have therapy for 1. But he recognized it was also somewhat of a disaster because if you dose 1 child, they're going to be in the same household. The other child would definitely pick up the antibodies. So there was no hope that the second child would ever be able to get access to gene therapy. So this was a long stretch in terms of how do we get the second child diagnosed. Lots of advocacy on the parents' part. Parents worked very hard in terms of raising awareness. They were in the media. They were constantly being applied for. At the end of the day, the company stepped forth and offered 1 more dose. So both kids got diagnosed. And now they're both, of course, have been treated. They were older, so they've already developed some of the developmental issues. But at this point, of course, it actually opened up the pathway for newborn screening so that we had first child that was diagnosed at the age of 1 day and actually was able to get into a gene therapy program by the time she was, in fact, under the age of 1 month in terms of preparation. So as we say, the patient can actually have a huge impact in terms of what can happen. The challenge, of course, is even in a highly developed country like Canada, and as Paul talked about in terms of Australia, we don't necessarily have a program in place that actually allows for gene therapy to be brought in. And I think as soon as he recognized, there's the whole patient journey and being able to have access to all of the infrastructure in order to make it happen. It is a multi-step process. This is another family for a very different disease with retinal disease, Luxturna, which is, of course, able to treat, if you can get it early enough, to be able to treat the patient so that they will not lose their eyesight. It was a scramble for us in terms of trying to get access to this therapy for these patients. 3 years of constant media with the 1 boy. The sister had been actually treated in a clinical trial. And she actually was able to demonstrate the benefits of it. We couldn't get the boy treated. And it was a losing battle as he was getting ready to go to university. And it was really challenging in terms of his being able to live independently at university while at the same time trying to continue. He was actually quite a brilliant concert pianist. And we were really working hard. So again, lots of advocacy in order to get it. What we realized over and over again was that in both of these cases, it was in fact the patients, the families, the media, and all of the work that actually got the attention in order to open up these gene therapies. So the role of the patient advocate, is still very strong in many of these cases. In fact, the first 6 children in Canada to get SMA gene therapy were all funded through crowdfunding. The brilliance of that was that it actually opened up a lot of expertise. It opened up a program for us to be able to identify children and to be able to follow through on them. So never, I think what we realize is over and over again is the power of the patient, the power of that individual story in order to create what would have to be the infrastructure, have to be the pathways in order for us to be able to bring this in. And now, of course, in Canada, as in many of the developed countries, we not only have newborn screening, we also have identified specialist sites in which children can be treated, and we have a long-term follow-up program which will allow us to be able to demonstrate what the benefits of this are. And again, some of what you heard in the video, very much the same case we have with one of the little kids we just saw recently, not only being able to run and walk around, he's playing hockey. Pretty amazing. And of course, in Canada, everybody plays hockey. So this kid is right there. So what role can the patient organizations play in supporting care, delivery, and access? And I think this, again, reinforces, I guess, what Neil was saying, is that patient organizations actually can play a huge influence in terms of organizing the patient voice, organizing the advocacy, organizing, in some cases, the actual funding in order to get therapy started. And we've seen this not in many other countries as well. One of the cases here in terms of Taiwan, the Taiwan Foundation for Rare Disorders were one of the first ones who actually advocated for SMA therapy when it was still Spinraza, made a huge campaign for it, got the government to approve Spinraza. The brilliance of that actually is the same as in Canada. What makes gene therapy cost effective? Same as in hemophilia. If you're funding already very expensive therapies on a continuous basis, suddenly gene therapies become very cost effective. And in this case, they were able to make the case because they had several years earlier gotten the funding for continuous infusions for Spinraza, were now able to make the case that providing a one-time therapy over the long term was very cost effective. The same as we're talking about in terms of hemophilia. The same as we can make the case in many other treatments, in many other diseases where continuous treatment is necessary. And we've seen this actually, I spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, and we've been able to use this as an opportunity to try to stimulate other countries to come on board. Obviously, country has to have the resources to do it, has to have the infrastructure. But one of the things we're finding is that countries learn from each other. So the case in Taiwan stimulated Hong Kong. Now what we're trying to do is to actually have the same replication in Malaysia, where in fact at this point they're still only funding it on a case-by-case basis, but that creates the opportunity for learning from it to be able to demonstrate the benefits of it. We'll be in Manila at this point, and I was just saying I had an interesting meeting with the health minister there, and he was very clear. He says, I can't fund 10,000 diseases, but maybe I'll fund one rare disease. So if we can get started, and it's where the patient advocacy voice is going to be to help open that up. So in many countries now, we're still seeing the ability to bring in these therapies, even as very high-cost therapies, on a case-by-case basis. So if we can actually create individual countries, individual patients, individual patient groups to be able to stimulate this, and we can use that across a region, we're able to also be able to demonstrate kind of a much more beneficial. I know in Canada, of course, we always point to the US and what is happening there. It makes it a much better opportunity for us to be able to have individuals and families, and in many cases, sometimes related families, to be able to demonstrate what's happening elsewhere. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doreen, and all of the speakers for these great presentations. We are running a bit behind schedule, so we have now panel discussions about your presentation. So I'll kind of ask you to, really to keep your answers or your comments as short as possible, but that can be helpful as well for all of us to have a good understanding of what is your message. And my first question to Duran, and Sunhi, Duran first, is what is needed? So what's your view and what is needed for you to have patients access these therapies? Not just access, but having diagnosis and access to care.
You want to start?
You asking me?
Yeah, you're.
It's interesting. I'm listening to Paul and I'm hearing top-down solutions, which I think is great. But we realize, even as you say it from top down, it's a hard sell. So I think if we've got top-down and we've got bottom-up, it really can actually help to seal the case, right? There's got to be the willingness to have the policy. There's got to be a willingness to invest in some of that infrastructure. But I'm very much struck by, the minister from Manila who says, I can't do it all. Maybe I can do one. And I think we're now much more appreciative. We can do one at a time, and we can get our foot into it. we should really take advantage of that to be able to move it further out. So from my point of view still, even as we're talking about these being, therapies that could have tremendous value in the long run, for most countries, as you know, we don't have monies for the long run. So if we can do one at a time, then let's do one at a time.
Thank you.
I'll focus maybe on the providers side of things, because in order for patients to get access to a therapy, they need to know that those options exist. And the way that they know that those options exist is through their doctor. And there is a significant knowledge gap among physicians on what gene therapies are, how they work, what patients are eligible, and what the implications are over a patient's life. And I think that that might be an area that would be, a great area of focus and investment.
Thank you very much. And you talk about providers. I would like to ask Paul to dig a bit into this. Sorry. We talk about one care model, hub and spoke delivery. What do you think is needed to implement that model?
Yeah, the hub and spoke model is a model that's of value in Australia because it's such a large country with very few people. And we lent heavily on the solid organ transplant hub and spoke model in Australia, whereby we have a couple of hubs where the transplant procedures are undertaken, but we have underlying policy and processes to expedite patient access for patients who live in rural and regional areas to access those hubs. But that's predicated on the clinicians talking to each other on a regular basis and providing the relevant care. Because as we all know, patients thrive, patients recover best when they're home, close to home. So with our hub and spoke models for solid organs, we have used that as a model to try and establish a hub and spoke model for gene therapies to ensure patient access. There's critical mass of care providers, but there's also support back home so they can get back home and continue their family lives.
Thank you. And Jennifer, what do you think industry can do in this process to, what could be the contribution?
Sure, thanks, Paulo. I think as you highlighted in your introduction, gene therapies are highly complex technologies that have, complex care pathways as well and require ultimately multiple multidisciplinary teams with technical expertise and capability. And I think, given these complexities, you need to have a care delivery model that ultimately coordinates both administration and post-administration care. And we know that, these models can take many forms, one of which are centers of excellence. And so from the industry perspective, we really work with, centers of excellence within healthcare institutions, for example, hospitals, where we work to understand, what the needs are to ensure that ultimately the therapies that we're bringing to the table from an innovative perspective can reach patients. And, I would highlight, three particular capabilities that we look for and that we help to support the execution and implementation of these care deliveries at the centers, and those include patient flow. So that in fact means that we understand, again, the needs, the tools, the fact that these centers in fact have diagnostics to identify patients, to also conduct and identify eligibility tests, ultimately to administer the therapies themselves, but also to provide short and long-term monitoring. From the Pfizer perspective, we work with these centers to ensure that, we can provide targeted education to help support multidisciplinary teams. The second area that we look for is payment flow. So we also work within the boundaries of, local and national policy frameworks to ensure that our contracts can be adaptable and really fit within various models of reimbursement and insurance. And in that way, we are able to support access ultimately for patients. And then finally, I would note the importance of product flow at centers of excellence. So this is also ensuring, frankly, at a very basic level, as many others have mentioned, that we have the fundamental infrastructure in terms of the ability for the centers to store gene therapy, to handle, prepare, and dispose of the therapy as well. And I think it's also important to note that the role of industry is really multifactorial. So we're trying to help share our expertise, listening to the patient community, working with these centers, and that it's going to evolve as the technology evolves. So as, for example, Paul just mentioned, I think hub and spoke models will be a critical aspect as we look forward to really helping to support care delivery.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. And now let's move to Jennifer to present the next, presentation. And we are now moving to, from patient care delivery into the access part of the discussion. So that's the next session.
Great. Thank you so much, Paolo, for the introduction. As you mentioned earlier, we have several thousand cell and gene therapy therapies in the pipeline. And although gene therapies hold tremendous promise for patients, we also know that this novel approach poses new challenges for health systems as a whole. So today I'm going to be speaking about some of these challenges, but also opportunities for industry and other stakeholders to work together to help ensure health system preparedness to absorb and ultimately implement these new innovations. So for gene therapy especially, patient access is not just about having a treatment on hand for eligible patients, but it's about health system strengthening and preparedness as a critical prerequisite. We need to ensure that manufacturers, governments, patient groups, and many stakeholders work together to help ensure health system readiness for innovative treatments. And for example, as Pfizer, as a multinational manufacturer, we have a global footprint with sites in 69 countries, and we're also helping to support access in many, many countries all over the world. We have a diverse team that covers all areas from clinical, regulatory, medical, procurement, and policy, as well as expertise across different disease areas. And I think working at the market level and really being able to understand what patient needs are, really understanding the healthcare context, and frankly what the challenges are, it helps us to ultimately raise awareness and help to ensure that we can co-create solutions that meet the diverse needs of these health systems and patients. So as others have highlighted today, the inherent characteristics of novel technologies like gene therapy and the diseases that they treat do put tremendous pressure on existing healthcare delivery and access frameworks. As a result, partnerships are critical. So at Pfizer, we believe it's important to, as I mentioned, work with the patient communities as well as with provider organizations, health authorities, and others to ensure that we are really understanding the needs at all levels, both international, national, and local level, to help support health system readiness and ensure that these therapies ultimately get into the hands of patients. So here I wanted to highlight 3 key areas that we have been able to really work with various stakeholders to help progress in terms of our ability to deliver these critical treatments to patients. So one example is improving the availability and delivery of care through specialized outreach, diagnosis, and access programs. Pfizer has been very proud to be partnering with the World Federation of Hemophilia for more than 30 years through a program called the Twinning Program. And the Twinning Program really helps to match up low and middle income countries, treatment centers, but also patient organizations to ensure that we can ultimately help support best practice sharing, as well as improve the treatment and care of patients living with hemophilia. Really delighted to share that this partnership has resulted in nearly 275 initiatives specifically supporting hemophilia patients and is spanning over 119 countries. Another example is our work with Rare Impact. And this is an evidence gathering collaborative that we've been working with. It involves patients, it involves industry and nonprofit groups to help to support and improve patient access to ATMPs within Europe. And then finally, I wanted to highlight here our work to support data collection, ultimately to help support innovative outcomes-based contracting solutions. And one example of our work here is with the World Federation of Hemophilia's Gene Therapy Registry. And this is a prospective, observational and longitudinal registry that is designed to collect long-term safety and efficacy data post-gene therapy infusion. So the novelty and unique characteristics of gene therapy and frankly other ATMPs means that, in most cases we are still learning about how to manage these access challenges. So I want to highlight a recent example of how a country has taken some positive steps toward adapting their payment models to better support access to ATMPs. So a little bit of context. As we know, the high upfront price of gene therapies presents a financing challenge for many health systems that are particularly accustomed to a pay-per-prescription model for chronic therapies. We know that novel payment models, however, can play a key role to support timely access to treatments, though we know also that their adoption has varied across countries. And outcomes-based agreements are generally more complex than other financing models, particularly because we're still working to understand, how we can split payments, for example, how to perhaps support legislation to support installment payments and the like. But we continue to work across many different countries to help support the fact that these agreements ultimately will enable access to patients. So specifically, the example here is with respect to France. In France, we have seen that historically novel payment models have not been routinely used to support ATMP access. However, in 2023, a Social Security finance bill was passed which enabled the implementation of split payments for innovative treatments. This has been a pretty significant milestone, and frankly, one that I would suggest could be a best practice to adopt in other markets. Industry has supported this change by raising awareness of the potential of these treatments for patients. We've been educating on the need for alternative payment models and developing evidence to support the policy change. And as mentioned, France has implemented this by putting in place the legislation, though we know that some challenges, of course, remain. For example, there's some discussions ongoing about how to fully operationalize the novel payment framework. But again, this is a huge step forward in terms of how governments can take action to implement meaningful policy change to support access and more creative solutions to supporting gene therapies. So another example that I want to highlight is the importance of real-world evidence. And one example here is the fact one of the most promising aspects of ATMPs is the potential for long-term, potentially transformational effects. But we know that there unfortunately continues to be an absence of long-term clinical data for these novel products, particularly at the point of launch. And that in turn creates uncertainty about the safety and efficacy of patient response and whether adverse events could potentially manifest over time. So we know that real-world evidence has the potential to address these challenges as well as support timely patient access. But there are several hurdles. These include, for example, lack of clarity on responsibility or correct procedure, as well as uncertainty on how real-world evidence can inform decisions. And overcoming these challenges and building greater alignment on real-world evidence standards, criteria, and use is critical as the pipeline continues to grow. And while individual manufacturers are responsible for running clinical trials and creating evidence plans to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of our innovations, when systematic change is required, we really need to come together across industry and across many different groups to develop frameworks and best practices. So again, real-world evidence for decisions is one example of how we're doing this. It's a multi-stakeholder initiative. It's been commissioned by the Belgian National Institute of Health and Disability Insurance, and it brings together industry, health authorities, and payers, and many others to really foster agreement on what real-world data can be collected for highly innovative technologies such as gene therapy, and ultimately to help generate real-world evidence that informs healthcare decision-making. And the impact of this is that, it's quite significant. I think we've been able to incorporate a lot of the insights based on the evidence gathering into reports that ultimately are now informing some of the shared decision making. And some of the recent recommended actions that have come forward based on our analysis include the creation of evidence generation for earlier in the R&D process, acting upon recommendations from ISPOR, real-world evidence, or other initiatives. We're also able to engage more readily with this evidence, for example, with HTA bodies. And we're also communicating on generation throughout the gene therapy life cycle. So this year, Real World Evidence for Decisions is continuing their efforts. They're hosting webinars. We're seeing a broader dissemination in broader fora, which is incredibly exciting for us. And I would note that these initiatives are coming at a time when, a pivotal time in Europe, when we know from a policy and legislative perspective, there's a ton of change happening. So we've got the EU pharma legislative reform ongoing, a potential paradigm shift in HTA with the implementation of the joint clinical assessment, which will come into play in January. So there's an incredible opportunity here, frankly, for partners to continue working together to look at ways to accelerate and frankly better support health system readiness for gene therapies. So with that, I will now give it back to Paulo.
Thank you, Jennifer. The next speaker is Mauro for the last presentation, then we'll continue with the panel.
Last but not least, the financial dimension and how we have to deal on the financial for the public budget and the European system of national account, this kind of therapy. In the last 2 years, I spent a lot of time discussing with Treasury executive, trying to convince. I was an economic advisor over there, so not executive. I'm a professor, but it was so. I don't want to. Just a second. I'm going to follow but just to elaborate a little bit. It was impossible for me to try to realize that they did not understand. Saying in different way, they understand very well. They know that there is this issue between current investment, current expenditure, cash expenditure, or if the ATMP or gene therapy are a current expenditure or a kind of investment. They know very well that it's a type of investment. But the ministries of economy and finance fear that if they allow or admit that GT are investment, we have to follow procedure cash budget, and also to pay in installments or following the investment procedure. And they fear that they are going to lose the control over the budget, given the cost of the GT. So I understand very well, but it's a strange story that after 30 years teaching at university, some people start to discussing again what's the definition of investment, current and capital. We start many centuries ago, maybe at the time of Adam Smith, what's the meaning of current, what's the meaning of investment. But anyway, I would follow the slide to be very brief. Let me start by reminding the main clinical economic feature of gene therapy. They restore and correct compromised physiological function by correcting this genetic mutation that we have seen very well. The problem is that they provide one-shot treatment with a single administration. All the costs are concentrated in the short run, not the short run, sorry, in 1 year. That's the problem. While this therapy tend to produce many benefits in the medium long terms. So that's, per se, is the definition of investment. If there is something that the costs are very concentrated in 1 year, but the flow of benefits unfold in the medium long term, this is the definition of investment that I try to teach to my students. Maybe I'm wrong, but anyway. So if this is true, the traditional reimbursement scheme that we have in Europe, and I think also in the United States, that give for a simple product. Most of the discussion with the Treasury in Rome was that gene therapy is like an aspirin. Also aspirin, there is a component of investment in the medium long term, but of course, the component of investment is very small, while with gene therapy, most of the component is an investment. Anyway, the traditional reimbursement scheme are not adapted, does not fit with the gene therapy. Therefore, we have to go back to the distinction between current and capital. It's a very old discussion, and essentially an expenditure is current when the benefit lasts just 1 year, to make very long story very short given the time constraint. And an expenditure is an investment when, of course, this expenditure, the goods and services by the expenditure, last for many years and last in the medium and long term. So gene therapy, of course, they have a fixed capital component. That's very, I have not time to go into detail, but it's very easy to understand that is the main issue of gene therapy. And the main issue is that there is this asymmetry, temporal asymmetry, time-based asymmetry between the costs and benefits. Costs are upfront, benefits are unfold and provided in the middle long term. The period over which the cost and benefit of gene therapy are incurred are different. Therefore, if we admit that in part, or for most of the part, gene therapy are a kind of investment, we need some a very important account innovation, at least at the European level. In Europe, we have the system of national account that is used by Eurostat and also by the European Commission that provide that country use accrual budget. That is to say, all the expenses that are decided in 1 year, also if they spread across the many years, have to be recorded in the budget in the year where the requirement of the expenditure has come. Why, if there is this long-term dimension, we can use the investment procedure and also the cash budget. Now, the European Commission and the Eurostat launched several informal working groups, try to make progress on this subject. Just to say something, for example, most of the military expenditure, bombs, tanks, and so on, are by definition considered as an investment, while the value of human life or other things are not an investment. So we need to adapt and completely change that condition of some people and so on. Completely, I know the problem for the budgetary rule, for the budget procedure, but the problem that we need to adapt the concept of capital that we use in the statistical procedure and in a system of national account. To go to the end, the last slide, having realized that this is the issue, the Treasury fear that they are going to lose control over the expenditure, and it's a good argument. I mean, we suggest with the Vita Group, with the Vita Solution, and in Italy and also in Europe, that just to be sure, at least at the start, that we start with a special fund for advanced therapy, let's say 100 million, 200 million, whatever they want, just a limited sum of money, just to start, and to try to apply this model that have this asymmetry between cost, all up front, and benefit that spread across the years. And also to convince the Treasury Department that they have to consider with the cost-benefit analysis this dimension and the flow of benefit in the medium long term. Second, also to implement an analog law containing this specific multi-year expenditure authorization to consider the flow of benefit that tend to repay the cost in the year of the gene therapy. Therefore, this is a very big challenge, but I think that we need to make this step because I don't think that the national authority, the Treasury Department, the ministries of economy and finance can avoid to accept an approach, a reasonable approach, a sound public finance approach to deal with this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Moret. Let's move into the panel discussion and the conclusion of this symposium. So This session, we have been covering the access part, right? So how these therapies, and mainly the perspective that we got so far from all presentations was mainly from higher income, medium and higher income countries. And that will be, I would say, I presume, the focus of the discussion. And, and we are in a situation where, let's say, these new therapies are revolution in medicine. So the impact on patients potential is huge. They are very complex. They are resource consuming. So there is, both in terms of healthcare delivery and also in the therapies themselves, there is a need for investment for healthcare systems. Of course, on the industry side, there is commitment and work to be done on making these therapies more and more available over time. So there is, let's say, an effort in terms of cost and manufacturing and prices, but also there will need to be an effort from healthcare systems to find solutions to grant access to these therapies. And there are two main drivers, I will say, from the presentations that we had so far. So one is in terms of what is the evidence needed to prove the value of these therapies. We have seen the video from Amanda and Weston and SMA case. In terms of efficacy, I guess there is no doubt, right? So when you see a video like this, and there are many different examples of patients that have been treated with gene therapies, it's pretty straightforward in terms of the effect. But then there are still questions about how long this effect will last, right? So, and that's a very close link to the price that payers are able and willing to pay, and there is uncertainty around that. So that's, I would say, it's more the evidence part. And then, as Mauro was saying, there is how to pay for these drugs. What are the financial arrangements? And more complex, let's say, payment models. And that's, there's this idea that we are investing in health outcomes. We are investing in a better, let's say, quality of life and life for many patients and for society in general. So back to the first point, I would like to ask Paul, and we have been talking about JCA that will start next year in Europe. What's in your experience, from the HTA perspective, what is the right approach to this?
What a great question. The analogy I've been using for the last few years is that we're trying to build the plane, or trying to fly the plane as we build it, because as Jennifer said before, this is complex and it's moving so fast and so quickly. And my experience is that groups around the world, whether they're funders, policymakers, reimbursers, HTA people, they're reinventing the wheel a lot of the time. One of the things I think that can speed up and democratise much of the decisions, if you will, is to harmonise and better communicate, better collaborate with agencies around the world. At the end of the day, the evidence doesn't change. Whether you're sitting in Australia, Germany, Canada, anywhere in the world, the evidence doesn't change. And so do we need to do incessant HTAs of safety and clinical effectiveness? I'll just leave that there, but a lot in terms of the investment, the financial side, this reflects that this is moving so quickly, there isn't a very clear understanding of the funding model, the investment model. So again, this is where we need the regulators, the funders, to actually talk to each other, to communicate and trial different models. And models will vary from country to country, depending on a country situation. But I think we can do this in a more systematic manner and share information, share what works and what doesn't work globally, so that we ensure that we have a system which by its nature is evolving rapidly, it's dynamic, but there are things that we can do, I believe, through communication and collaboration to ensure that we're sharing the right information, we're sharing experiences, and that can result in expedited patient access.
Thank you, Paul. Jennifer, I'd like you to add to this question your perspective.
Yeah, so I think, standard value and assessment frameworks as well as reimbursement frameworks are not necessarily set up for accommodating the innovation that comes with gene therapy. So I do think that there's an opportunity to perhaps bring to the table additional elements of value when decision makers are considering, how ultimately to provide coverage and ultimately access to these therapies for patients. And in terms of, what other elements they could look at, for example, it could include sort of the broader and longer impact of the treatments on patients and caregivers, obviously recognizing the fact that gene therapies have the potential to be, truly transformational from a health perspective. I think the other aspect that can and should be considered from a broader value assessment point of view is the longer economic impact to health systems overall. Because we know that with these therapies, as we saw in the video with Amanda, these are truly transformational, right? So we are seeing, fewer interventions potentially, fewer needs to go to, seek out healthcare throughout a patient's life than they otherwise would need to do. So I do think there's a key opportunity there, working together across different stakeholders to really bring to bear additional elements of value to be reflected in decision making.
Thank you. And on that one, I would like to add, because we had a few examples from presentations on SMA, and I think SMA is a great example in terms both on efficacy, but also what are the challenges of developing evidence. So in this case, for Zolgensma, the pivotal trials were single-arm trials. And the reason why they were single-arm trials is that patients have a very short window of opportunity to be treated. So as Doreen said, if you don't treat patients, I would say in the first, between 0 and 8, 9 months, or in the first year, the chances of the drug having an effect are very slim. And the effect is actually very high, if you have early diagnosis, so screening, newborn screening, early diagnosis, and early treatment. So it's not ethical to have randomized controlled trials for patients that if they're not assigned to the gene therapy arm, they basically will miss the opportunity to be treated forever, right? So in this case, it's a very easy example to show this. And HTAs, and we have the example in Europe with the joint clinical assessment, are asking randomized controlled trials. Mm-hmm. And we are in this discussion, okay, let's try to find a way through this, because there are 54% in gene therapies that are pivotal trials, so about to get to the market, that are basically have single-arm trial, pivotal trial, right? So we know that at least half of these gene therapies will not have a randomized controlled trial when they will be assessed by JCA. So the question is, how do we find a way through this, a solution that is pragmatic, that is helpful for everybody, that can provide strong evidence for HTA assessors, and is feasible for developers? And this, I think, this is a good example. It's something that we're working hard as a community of stakeholders, and it's one example of how things can be changed in practice. And real-world evidence is definitely a way through this. So how to increase the quality of this evidence, how to make, kind of have a shared view on how this evidence can be helpful to address the questions, legitimate questions from HTA bodies and payers. Doreen, what is your perspective? What do you think, how patient perspective should be taken into account into this process?
Paula, you know what my perspective on this is. I mean, HTA was never designed for these innovative therapies, even some of the rare disease therapies, right, that are not so innovative. I mean, it was designed for something very particular at one point when you had incrementally better medicines, and so is it worthwhile to pay? So now we're trying to force feed, a model and try to make it adapt to something like a gene therapy when it will never work. I mean, if you can think of the absurdity of this, if you think about some of our middle-income countries, there's no way that we will ever come up with an economic or an assessment solution that's going to make a cost-effective case for a gene therapy, for an innovative therapy to be available in these countries, and yet they should be. So I think we need to take a big step back. I mean, we say in many cases for some of the innovative therapies for rare diseases, if we can collect the evidence over a period of time, at that point when we've got enough evidence and we aren't discounting everything because of uncertainty, then we could maybe do an HTA. I say that's ridiculous. By that time, who cares? You've already paid for the product. You already know what you're paying for it. So I think we should quit trying to make HTA give us an answer. It's never going to give us an answer. I think we need to rethink the whole model. But the other thing I will say is that, you know, even listening to what Jennifer's saying or what Mauro's saying, that's never going to work in any country that doesn't already have a really good financial basis. So what are we saying? I mean, I think we need to take a look and say, what are we talking about? It was like HIV. If we had waited for countries to be able to afford HIV and have the evidence that, you know, treatments for HIV work, we would have a world that's still raging with HIV, especially in lower income countries. I think we need to rethink the whole model. So, no, Paulo, I hear what you're saying. I really agree that looking for randomized control trials and this is nonsense, but it's nonsense beyond just the fact that we need to have a different way of getting them to agree that we don't need to have randomized control trial. I think we need to step away from it entirely. I don't know how you convince governments of doing that, but I think we can all collectively say this is nonsense. We're never going to get there.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. And I really appreciate and I share your sense of urgency, you know, on trying to find solutions that really address these huge unmet needs. And I agree with you that, you know, we shouldn't waste time in discussing things that probably are interesting from an academic standpoint, but, you know, reality is very different. This said, we have to live with, you know, healthcare systems as they are, and we have to, you know, to work and push them to adapt. So I know that, you know, personally I think that we should look at both things. So both, you know, the breakthrough and drastic changes, but also there is a day-to-day work for each of us in improving things. Keep in mind that we don't have time. So we need to go fast. So thank you very much for your comment. You want to say something?
Oh, you know, it's back to the basics, right? The emperor has no clothes. Why do we keep trying to pretend? I mean, I say that out of genuinely seeing all the patients that are waiting for us to come back with something that might actually offer a solution. And I think right now we're still looking at the finance of this because we're looking at a very, very small patient population that's ever going to get access to these therapies. If we were to think about the world as having access to this and some other ways of doing it, I think, you know, we came to gene therapies not because people were using the same technologies in terms of developing medicines. So what makes us think the same technologies in terms of financing them are going to give us an answer?
Thank you.
Agree with everything you said, Tahan. In Australia, over the last 18 to 24 months, there's been a national review underway to look at the health technology assessment and reimbursement system in Australia. And the report was handed down with its 50-odd recommendations last month. And I think what's going to happen is the whole system's going to be blown up and rebuilt with an aim to ensure that there is better collaboration and communication with relevant stakeholders around the world, ensure there's patient and family input into the processes, as a means to try and expedite patient access. So Australia is talking a lot around, is looking at models in the funding models in France and Germany, for example, and the UK to try and work out how do we pay for how can we get patients accessing these therapies sooner rather than later, while behind the scenes we can work out the methodology, because it's important to get these treatments that work to patients first and foremost.
Thank you. Sung-hee, what's your view on this? And I'm thinking more, you know, in terms of follow-up and, you know, the long-term data, the long-term effect, you know, how to measure this.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Doreen and Paul just talked about. You know, we are jerry-rigging a current system for these innovative therapies. But I will say that when we think about the long-term data collection requirements that have been placed by FDA on the gene therapies that are available in America, there is a requirement for 15 years of follow-up. Now, that is an incredible amount of data that will be collected over that period. And there is an opportunity to bring not only the regulators together into that conversation, but also the payers and researchers and patient groups and health systems, so that when this data is being collected, it is not only in service of the regulators, but it's actually in service of the entire ecosystem. And if we don't think about that ahead of time, then the burden falls on patients and providers to participate in that data collection activity over and over and over again.
So can I answer Cindy for a second? It works in the US because patients are getting access. I mean, I think that's the difference. I know we fully support long-term data collection. We fully support as much as possible having that data be also automatically available. And I think that's important. But the difference is you're getting access because you've got private insurers who are making it available. The challenge in many other environments, especially where there's public healthcare systems, is nobody's getting access while we all kind of wait and see what's going to be the total answer. And so, I mean, I think many of us would not necessarily say, okay, we should all go to private insurance, but I think what the private insurance is saying, you almost have to do it patient by patient, case by case, and get people started, get that evidence collected. So absolutely, I mean, by some kind of a strange twist, I mean, the system has now kind of come back to being able to say, you know, is there another way in which we can have a public system where we can actually get patients to get access first, collect the data, analyze it as we go along, rather than waiting for us to have a full data set to be able to say, okay, we got it, we got enough evidence. We now are able to demonstrate that if we fund somebody for 12 years, we're going to get that payback. I got 12 years.
Indeed, indeed. 100% agree. Mauro, we have been talking about, you know, the investment side of things. So it's very much a financial thing as well, right? So what's your suggestion for, you know, in this discussion, what's your perspective in terms of how,
Yeah, I think that to be, let's say, possible, we need to solve this conundrum, this dilemma between financial sustainability and the investment nature of gene therapy. For that reason, Vita Group tried to suggest this solution that is a compromise, a step by step, because I want to be clear. I'm sure that gene therapy for most of the largest part are an investment, that's sure. But on the other hand, I understand that Treasury Department fear to lose control over expenditure given the cost and also the budget or the deficit. So we need to find a compromise step by step. The idea to start by a special fund with a limited amount of money and to make a trial to try to understand if we suggest something like 300 million for 3 years, but it's not important, the amount of money. Just to make a try, see what's going on, and then also considering the flow of benefits, because see only the cost part, of course, they're not correct. Seeing also, estimating also the flow of benefits, and try to understand what's going on and what will be not only the Italian solution, but also I know in France, in Spain, and if we can get a European solution to have a good handle in budgetary terms for gene therapy.
Thank you, Mauro. And we are out of time, and we could spend other 2 hours here chatting about this. And I would like to thank you, thank the panelists for this. For me, it was an interesting one, and you on the audience for listening to us. Thank you very much.